Now, we've sort of set the scene. We've got geometry, we've got some other data that's there. We're ready to start adding some raster files. So let's go to where, like I said, where all the magic happens, right here in the raster manager. And we're going to start attaching a couple of images to this. So first off, as I mentioned to you, you've got batch convert in here, and you've got a whole lot of different tools. We're going to cover a lot of these. We're going to start with attaching an existing raster. Now, there are some new raster options that are here. For example, when I say new, it's under file new, not that they're brand new to MicroStation. But you have things like WMS. We'll talk about that next month, in fact. We're going to start with these. You can see there's different types that are available. You can attach Bing maps and so on. We're going to start with attaching, in this case, some Mr. SID files, right? So we'll select raster. And I'm going to go out there and I'm just going to pick a series of these files, right? So I'm going to just pick a series of them. And I'm going to click OK. And you'll see the raster attachments dialog up here. All right, so this is kind of important for us here. What this tells us is if we want to attach this interactively, for example, these images, do they have the information about where they need to go? Where is the upper left pixel of that image? Yeah, they're in there. I don't want to place it interactively. We'll talk about that a little bit later today. And there's some other options, and we're going to cover all those. And we might just say, all right, we're ready to go. Let's click attach. And notice I attach those with attachment is defining where they will need to be, what's called the geo priority. Well, first off, if you take a look, I don't see anything appear underneath there. And if I fit this, did they end up in the right location? No, not at all. In fact, you can see right here, this is the area we're working in. They ended up out here. What did I do wrong? Well, we're going to talk about that in a moment. But what I want to do first is let's talk about just attaching another image to this and talk about a couple things. Then we'll go back and we'll fix all this. So first off, I attached a series of Mr. SID files. I attached them, directly, in this case, into the DGN file. Just so you're aware of it, you can open up, a raster image directly. You can go to File Open and just open up that particular file. But obviously, we're in the file. It's read-only. I can only open up one file at a time, but just so you know, you can go to File Open and open it up directly. In fact, this is that same area, but back in this case in 1968. So we're going to go back to that. And from here, let's add another image to this. We can play around with this a little bit, and then we'll focus on, getting everything in the right location. All right, so I'm going to throw in another image that we can play around with. And let's go and pick from that same area. I'm going to pick a different image, one from about 2006. And the same thing, I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's attach it with the default. You can see it drops right over the top of it. So first off, when you look at Raster Manager, you look at the images that are out there, if you select them in the list that's here, you'll see them highlight, right? You see a little boundary that appears around the outside of it. You can select a series of images that are out there, and they'll all highlight as well. Now, you can select an image by just moving your cursor over the top of the boundary itself. The edge of one of those images, you'll see it appears up. It tells me what the name of the Mr. SID file is and, the raster image and so on, okay? Now, we know that these aren't in the right location. Oh, and by the way, I should mention, how can you know this was Florida without me telling you it? Well, let me make this a little smaller and just slide it over. One quick way in Florida is the blue roofs that you see here. Those roofs aren't blue, those are tarps. This image happened to be taken in 2006, right after Hurricane Katrina went through Florida. And you can see, quite a few of those roofs have some damage to it. Almost every house has some little damage to the roof. So let's talk about, kind of ordering these. So first off, you have the images themselves that appear. If I come in and let me scroll all the way up here, I'm going to select these three. All right, so all three of those images are selected. There are some specific viewing tools that are available for these images. For example, if we were to take a look at the display tools that are here, you have things like fit rasters to view, fit all rasters to the view. If I select fit raster to view, what's going to happen? It fits those three that I have selected. If I have just one selected, for example, let me go all the way down in my list. That's this one here. Again, I could do the same thing, such as fit raster to view. It fits just that particular image to the view. So you can select them interactively if you choose to by, in this case, just selecting on the border, and that'll highlight it here in the list as well. These can be certainly, made sure so that they're in the correct location. As I mentioned, these are sitting somewhere off of Jacksonville. That's not really going to work, right? So we've talked a little bit about some of the viewing tools, that are there, and I'll get back to some of those. Your fit tools, by the way, speaking of about viewing tools, the fit tools that are here also will function for raster. So a quick way is just use that fit raster, and you're probably used to having, fit all, but you have the tools here as well. You have some other ones as well to bring to the front and send to the back. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Well, let's start with this. I'm going to detach all of these. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of those for right now. We know they didn't end up in the right place. There's something that isn't right. Now let me fit this so we can go back to where we were originally, which was right in this area. Now, I attach this using the attachment. In other words, in each of these files, we have a choice of how we want MicroStation to attach this. One, the geo priority that you saw listed in the raster manager, you also saw it in the attachment settings. That determines where the georeferencing and the positioning information come from. It can be stored a couple places. One, it can be stored in the raster file header for files that support that, for georeferenced file formats. Not all file formats are georeferenced. Again, remember the link I showed you earlier? That's a great place to determine if you need to, where those properties are stored or should be stored. Now, as I mentioned, you got the raster header, right? That's one place. You have the attachment. That's the DGN. And the DGN file is where you're going to have things like maybe a JPEG or something that doesn't have, that involved in the header itself. And then there's a third one that's out there, and that's really what's called a sister file or a world file. Okay. A sister or world file is what's going to tell it where it needs to be, located in this world. Now, there's nothing special about these sister files. In fact, we're going to look at one in just a moment, but let me make sure my levels are on. Let's make sure we're all good to go, because we're going to work on putting these in the right area, or so we think. Let's start with that. We think we're going to end up with them in the right area. And I got one more mistake that's built into this, because we want to talk about correcting that. So here it is. There's our boundaries. We know we're in the right area. There's our project. Let's toss a couple of images in there. But this time, we might want to use the sister file. We told it to just use the attachment, what's in the DGN. So let's tell it to use a sister file this time. But before we do, let's do this. Take a look at the slides. We're going to come and take a look at a couple things in these slides. Remember I mentioned about setting it up, sort of knowing what your units are and now what the geographic coordinate system is. Well, there's another couple things, the sister file. So when we have certain file types, in this case, like a Mr. SID file, they'd be in a separate file that'll have the same exact name, but it'll have a different extension. It'll be, instead of a SID file, it'll be like SDW. And if it was, another file type, it would be, TFW for, say, a TIFF, that kind of thing. But it's going to take the extension. It's going to have the same name, different extension. It's going to have a W in it, which stands for like a world file. Now, if we take a look at this world file that's shown on the left side here in the sister world file, you'll see it's pretty simple. There's really just these 6 lines that you see on the left side of that graphic. Those 6 lines that are there just simply tell it information about what size the pixel is. It tells it what the rotation is in the X and Y. It tells it information about the pixel size in the X and the Y direction. It also tells it, more importantly, the bottom two, which is the center, the X and Y of the center of the upper left pixel of that image. So this is what puts it in the right location. So one thing you can do is take a glance at that and say, okay, well, it's in there. There's information in there. If you know anything about the coordinate systems that you're working in and that kind of thing, you can certainly take a look at the coordinates that you're at. Here I am in distance and bearing, but you can take a look at that value that's here and see, does it match, close to what your project is? All right. So as I mentioned, Mr. SID file, special file type that's out there. What is it? Multi-resolution seamless image database. Bottom line, it's quick, it's fast. It offers some great compression without having to decompress the whole file. So it tends to be a little bit quick. But keep in mind, MicroStation supports all the different file types that are out there. Of all the file types that are out there, some are going to be quicker than others. Okay, this one happens to be fairly fast for what we need it for. The coordinates of where this thing gets stored are not stored internally within the image file itself. Again, that depends on the file type that's out there. As you can see, it's stored where? In that sister file. Now, when MicroStation goes to attach an image that has it in the sister file itself, we tell MicroStation, okay, if the coordinates are present in the image itself, and the image also might have an accompanying world file, in other words, the sister file that's there, MicroStation has some raster preferences that control where those coordinate systems should be read from. And I'm going to show you that in a second. So based on what we know, we know the images, we know they're correct. We got a world file. We should be able to, in this case, just go out and say, all right, let's attach those same images this time. But this time, and I'm picking a range of them, by the way, instead of doing one at a time, I'm going to say, let's go attach all those, but this time, let's not do the attachment. This will fix it, right? I'm going to pick sister file and say attach. I go, okay, did that fix it? No. Well, in fact, if I look, they're still sitting off of Jacksonville somewhere. I'm pretty sure the city of Plantation didn't move. This is our project. Why didn't they end up in the right location? I'm looking at the images. The images show that I have a coordinate system in there. One of the things that we can do to gather a little more information about an image might be to look for other files that are out there. For example, if y'all take a look back at the slide itself, that slide that was out there also has a little bit of an XML file. Now, for each one of those images that's out there, there happens to be an XML file. It's not always going to be there, but in this case, we got an XML file that has quite a bit of information about these images. Now, this gives us sort of a little key to what's going on here. If we take a look at them and we say, well, wait a minute, it's the raster units are mentioned in there. It says US survey feed in there. We know that that's what our DGN is set to. So, what's the problem? If you look, one, do the in your DGN file, do the units always have to match the image itself and the world file? Well, absolutely no. If you ever answer that they have to match, that's wrong, because think of it this way. If you had a metric project and you were trying to reference in or attach raster imagery that was metric, you got to be able to do that. So how does MicroStation handle that? Well, again, let me just detach these and let's talk about how do we fix that? How do we fix some of those problems? Well, those issues are dealt with by what are considered raster manager preferences. What controls the dialog box for attachment are some preferences that we need to make sure that you're comfortable with, because everything we just talked about, the problems that we just showed, are all specific to what I have my preferences set to. They're incorrect. They're not matching what the geometry is. So, for example, let's go back to, y'all are familiar probably with your preferences. I'm going to go to my settings off of, I'm going to select file and settings. And then from in here, I'm going to go to my user preferences. And there's a couple things that we probably just need to chat about when it comes to our raster manager. But before we do you remember how when I had the USA master map attached, when I lingered my cursor over the top of one of the state borders, the whole thing highlighted, right? So it's this large geographic area that highlights. In fact, I had to shut it off so you guys could see it, because every time I move my cursor over the top of it, it would highlight it. One thing that goes along with this concept of selecting these raster images is y'all see this located interiors. In our case, I want to shut that off because I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to just set this to never. Again, this is a personal preference. If you choose to leave it on, hey, that's fine. But for me, I want to just set that to never, because that actually comes into play. And that comes into play when we get down into our raster manager, when we see things like ignore locate interiors, right? So I'm going to make sure that's turned on. That way, when I just move my cursor over the top of a raster image, it doesn't just select it. I have to click on the border to select it. So that's the way I prefer it. Doesn't mean you have to do that. Now, one thing I will tell you is disable delete element. I want to make sure that's turned on. Okay, I'll tell you, and I chuckle when I say this, is that this has bitten me a few times where I quickly run in, I have something selected like a raster image, and I'm not really sure. I don't really know I have it selected, and I hit delete. What do you think happens then to that raster image? It detaches it. It doesn't delete it, but it just detaches it for you. This can get really annoying if you spend a fair amount of time with placing that in the right location, maybe doing a warp and a rotate and different things like that, which I'll show you later. So we're going to turn that one back on. Again, whatever you're comfortable with. If you want to have it left on, that's up to you. So just set it accordingly. There's a few other things in here, the use independent process. This thing just speeds things up for us a little bit. The auto update option that's at the top makes it a little bit easier to locate raster that might not be in your work set and workspace. It doesn't matter for what we're doing here. Draw raster bitmap. This really only comes into play when the images get really, really large. But when you do something like a move, and you'll see it in a moment, when you move a raster image or you rotate it, MicroStation, just like when drawing a regular element, it dynamically shows that, right? It rubber bands that raster image. It shows you a preview of it. That can get in the way when it comes to a really large image. It tends to slow things down a little bit. So that can be shut off. For what the size of the rasters we're working with, it's fine to leave on. But just wanted to mention that to you. All right, more importantly, the default attributes. Okay, so this sets the symbology and the options that you have for raster placement for what you see here. I'm going to actually turn all of this stuff off because I want to set, in my case, just the level. I probably didn't need to turn the rest off, but we will. And under the set defaults option that's here, what we can do is define what defaults we want at attachment. This dialog box looks familiar, right? This is the one that you see when you go to attach that raster image. So here we could say, hey, do we want to place it interactively? Maybe we never use a geographic coordinate system and we're just putting it over the top of a sheet. We're just trying to match an image. Then fine, no might be a perfectly acceptable way of having that set. But we can set it in here. Is it read only? Yeah. Do you want to open the settings dialog, which is this dialog? Yes, we do. And then we come down here and we say, well, all right, let's set this, because the attachment, I don't want that to define it. I want it to be that sister file. So we'll set that. Now, that by itself isn't going to fix our problem, and we'll get to that in just a moment. And there's some other options in here and so on, and I'm not going to worry about those except right here under the level. I don't want to just put it on the default level. I want these raster images to be on a particular level. If I come down and I just have one defined in here, just called raster images, and that's going to work just fine for what we need. And we can set the color, the line style, and so on of it, and that's really the border that goes around it. But that's good enough. And I'm going to click OK, because that's all I really need to set on these default attributes. All right, that by itself isn't going to fix our problem. If we went ahead and clicked OK and placed it, but still not going to fix our issue. Why? This is where our issues live. And that is because remember that if we want this to use a sister file, we need to tell it to use it. We not only need to do that, we need to tell it maybe save that location information. And if we look at the units, they sure don't match what's in that image that we had. Remember what that world file and that XML file had in it, right? It was in survey feet. So keep in mind, there's 3 places, as we talked about, where that geo-positioning can be kept. Now, we've got obviously the attachment, which is the DGN. That's one. It can be in the raster header of the raster image itself, and that is only certain images, those support that. So again, you can use that link that I provided to tell us if your image type supports that. Also, in my case, I'm going to check use this sister file. All right, and so what this is going to do is MicroStation now will use that sister's file, that SDW file that was out there, that world file. We also want to tell it to save location information to that sister file. And now we're going to tell it what units this needs to be. So what do we want to tell it? Well, in my case, it was survey feet, right? 1 survey foot unit in the sister file, 1 unit is equal to what in the raster file? Well, the raster file is also in survey foot. So sister file, raster file need to be set to US survey foot. This geo key you see here, we don't have to worry about it in our case because that really only applies to geotiffs. It sets the units based on the vertical units of that file or what the project coordinate system units are. But again, it doesn't apply to us, but we'll leave it on for sake of argument. And we'll click OK, and we'll go back to where we were. Now, let's go attach those images. Finally, right? 40 minutes to get images right location, but I wanted to chat about some of the setup because these are things you're going to run into. So if we take a look, we're going to talk now specifically about Raster Manager and ordering these, and we'll talk about some of the design, the planes, and setting the contrast and brightness and so on. But it all starts with this. We're going to come in and select all these SID files, and we're going to attach them. We'll attach them directly in the DGN file, or we're going to change anything here. No. Sister file, all good to go, attach. Do they end up in the right location? Well, absolutely. They end up exactly where they should be. Zoom in so y'all can see them after it updates. You can see our vector data that's there of our roadway project lines up exactly on top of what they need to be. These images were never wrong to start off with. It was, I built several errors into what we did here. One, I never checked my raster preferences. That's number one, as you just saw. And then the other thing is when I attached them, I didn't pay attention to how they would be attached. One of 3 ways. We did it as attachment, and now we've corrected it, and the units are correct. Therefore, they all appear where they should.
If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. If you want to see more such series, consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you, and see you next time.